We're going to look at this passage, those few verses from verse 35 to 40 in Luke 12 that was very beautifully read to us. Before we look at it, I'd just like to show you something about the actual style of the passage, because it often crops up. If you look at the Bible, if you study it, if you get some of the commentaries on it, it comes in there. And I think you have to remember, of course, that they were totally different. It's a totally different society to us. It's difficult, isn't it, to try and understand what life would have been like. I mean, there was no newspapers, there was no television. Very few of the people, except the wealthy, would have had any form of education. It was very basic. Not many people would have been literate. And even if they had been, there weren't many books to read. I mean, I don't know about you, but I devour books. I love books. I even read, I have a Kindle. I like a proper book, but Kindles are very useful because you can carry so much around with you. But there would have been no reading. There wasn't even sort of a communal newspaper. The news would have come if it ever came. Perhaps, they had the equivalent of what we used to have as town criers, perhaps. But they would have relied on merchants and people to bring them the news. And then, of course, the authorities would have told them things they needed to know. And for the Jews, that would have been in the synagogue, and the scriptures would have been read to them. They would have been read in Hebrew, whether they can understand them, because most of the people spoke Aramaic in Jesus' time. But Jesus spoke to them, and it said, isn't it, in the early days, that he was different. He had an authority, he had a way of speaking that the scribes and others didn't have. He was an amazing orator. But it's the setting of this. It's what I call it. It's a sandwich, and I get this from a guy called Kenneth Bailey. If you ever get a chance to read it, do. He's written a number of books. He spent his whole working life out in the Middle East, in Israel and that sort of area. And he's written a number of books, and one of them is Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes. And he explains how the passage sets out. And if you look at it, it sets out, doesn't it? It says, "Get dressed for service and keep your lamps burning. Be like people waiting for their master to come back from the wedding." So he's talking about servants. So he's actually setting out a sandwich. And the top and bottom of the sandwich are the preparation of the servants, or the prepared servants. So there he goes. He's got his piece of bread, servant prepared, bottom, servant prepared. That's the two pieces of bread. And it then goes on and he says in verse 36, he says, "And be like people who are expecting their master." And then at the end of it, he says, "Immediately they may open to him." That's filling. He's got some filling there. When he withdraws from the wedding banquet, so when he comes and knocks, immediately they may open. So we get these other layers that he puts in between the prepared servants. So you've got a prepared servant, you've got the people who are waiting for their master when he comes back from the wedding banquet. When he knocks at the door, they're ready to open. He puts that in the middle. So we've got the servants, we've got the filling. But then he comes back and maybe it was cheese and ham, I don't know. It wouldn't be ham, would it, for Jews? But anyway, whatever. The filling in the sandwich, you can put whatever you like in your sandwich. But then he comes and he puts a layer of pickle in, or a layer of chutney in, to make the sandwich really juicy. And so we get, "Blessed are those slaves." The servants have changed to slaves now, but it's the same thing. "Who coming, the master finds awake. I say he will gird himself and cause them to recline, to eat and come and serve them. If in the second or third watch he comes and he finds those servants awake, blessed are those slaves." So he's then packed it out even more. And it's all done so that he can actually bring it to a crescendo. And the bits that's important that we will see is, "and cause them to recline and come and serve them." That's the bit the Lord wants them to understand. That's the bit in the middle of the sandwich that is so important to the whole parable. We'll have a look at it now. But just remember, it is a sandwich, and this is the way the Lord explained it. So the Lord has been teaching his disciples and the crowds that followed him. He'd been teaching them without a break. He'd been telling them not to be anxious. Don't be anxious, don't worry. And that's a nice thought, but I live with someone who is quite anxious all the time. And she finds things to be anxious about, I think. But if you're of that nature, you can't help it, can you? But we can trust in the Lord. And he says, okay, we're going to move on. He said, and he gives the first indication that he's going to leave them and come back. He's not talking here about his death and resurrection, but he's physically going to leave them for an unspecified amount of time. But one day he will come back, not just for them, but for the whole church. He wants them to understand that freedom comes with responsibility, because people who are say, well, you don't have to worry about anything. You can get lazy and just say, okay, it's fine. I don't care. I don't have to do anything. I can just sit back and wait. No, he says that's not the point. You've got to be responsible. So as Christians, we have to take that on board, that we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to our master. There are only two types of people in this parable. One is the master, and the other are the servants. Just two basic people. One master, we're not told how many servants, depended on the size of the household, didn't it? And there again, we've got to put ourselves into the culture of the day, into the world of first century Palestine for this parable. Verse 35 talks about being dressed for service and lamps burning. That's the things that Jesus talked about initially. He says, you've got to be dressed for service and you've got to have your lamps burning if you're going to be ready. You want to be ready, this is what you've got to do. So the being dressed for service comes first, and it literally means, in old-fashioned words, what we used to have in here was girded loins. If you understand that everybody, male and female, would basically, the basic dress of the day was a long shift, went from shoulder to ankles, just went straight down. My wife's quite an accomplished dressmaker. She's modest about it, but I think she's brilliant. I mean, I couldn't do it. I would never get the pattern to fit. She does. She works it all out and it all comes out and she makes beautiful things. We're talking about how they would do it. She has a nice sewing machine, an electric sewing machine. She just presses the pedal and the stitches go in and her seams come out. Well, sometimes they come, most times they come out okay. Sometimes there's a few mutterings and then she has to undo it and stuff, but not very often. But what they would have done it by hand. And it would have been very basic, and a lot of it would have been woven, but they would be long and flowing because of the heat. They didn't want tight clothing, so it would be long and flowing, and the men probably wore a loincloth underneath or something like that. But what they're saying is, you've got to take this long robe of yours, and if you're going to be serving your master, it can't get in the way. So you're going to have to lift it up and you're going to have to tuck it in your belt. You're going to have to put a belt on and tuck it in so that your legs are free. We get this in, firstly, it pops up in Exodus. If you read if you remember in Exodus, when the angel of death was going to pass over, the last plague was coming, God gave instructions for the lamb. It said they had to choose a lamb, and then and this is in Exodus 12. And the 14th day of the month, it says on verse 6, and the whole assembly of the congregation shall kill their lamb at twilight. They've all taken a lamb from the flock, a perfect lamb, and they've got to kill them, and they shall take the blood, put it on the two doorposts and the lintel of the houses. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted with fire, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. And then in verse 11, in this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. So they were dressed, ready to go, to walk. They were dressed for service. Their loins were girded, their clothes were out of the way, so that when they went off, they didn't hinder them in any way. You are to eat it in haste. You are dressed to travel, your loins girded. It is the Lord's Passover. And if you were a servant, you would want to be ready. You wouldn't want anything to get in the way. You wanted to, if you were a good servant, you would want to please your master or your mistress. You wouldn't want to be coming up to them with a tray or a cup or something and trip over your clothes. That would not give a good impression. Your master, your mistress would not be pleased with you. And we get it today. I mean, I used to work in a pharmaceutical factory. And if I went into the production area, first thing we had to do is we had to sit down on a dividing barrier and put overshoes on. And then you washed your hands thoroughly, and then you put on a coat, and then you put on a hairnet, basically a hairnet. And because I had a beard, I had to put a snood on as well, so that you were covered as you went into a production area. And you get the same thing, don't you, if any of you have done the food preparation hygiene course. Washing your hands and keeping hair out of the way, it's all vital. And this is the same sort of thing. A servant would not want to be inappropriately dressed. So you would have your loins girded, you would have your clothes tucked up tightly out of the way so that you were ready all the time. This is not just, well, we'll do it later. No, do it now so you're ready. Secondly, it says your lamps burning. We're conditioned, aren't we, by these electrical things that, if it gets dark, if there's the light fades, we flick a switch and we have electricity. It's only a couple of generations back, I suppose, that it was slightly different. I mean, I can remember my parents talking about having oil lamps and going to bed with a candle. And then, of course, people started having gas lighting. We had a lady, a retired lady, lived next to us when I was a child, and she still had gas. She didn't have electricity, she had gas. And actually fascinating, she used to go along and she used to turn it on and light the gas through the mantle and then put the glass on the top, or she had a little oil lamp that she used to take to bed with her. So it's not that long ago, but we've become conditioned to electricity and all the benefits it gets. But even when we had candles and oil lamps, we had matches. They had matches. I can't remember when matches were invented, but they were wonderful because before that it was a tinder box. So you had a stone and a steel, and you had to strike a match, and it was very hit and miss. It depended how dry your tinder was and how good you were at giving a spark. And then once you got the spark, you had to blow it very gently to get it to come into flames. And from that flame, you could then light the wick of your lamp. And don't get thinking of the oil lamps that we had. These would just be basically a dish with a piece of rope, a whole piece of rope floating on the top that you had to light. And it's the parable, isn't it, of the foolish virgins, the wise and foolish virgins. They had to trim them. You had to keep pouring oil in to keep the level up. You had to make sure that your wick was well trimmed so it didn't get too big and it gave a good flame. And this is why Jesus says, keep your lamps burning. Don't wait until the knock comes on the door, because when the knock comes on the door, if you then decide you're going to light your lamp, you could be some minutes, and all this time you're keeping the master waiting. I think it was, I can't remember what it was, probably in the 18th or 19th century that they invented something called a dark lantern. So you could light the lamp and then there was a shutter came over it. The police used them so that they could be ready, and they would just pull the shutter back and there would be light. I wonder, no, I'm not going to say I wonder. I think this is definitely an instruction that we should learn to be reliant on the Spirit every day. It's not a question of, well, when we need him, we'll go looking for him. When we have a problem, we'll seek him. We should be seeking the Spirit every day. We should be keeping our loins girded. We should be there. We should be prepared. And we should keep our lamps burning. We should make sure that we go to God, to go to the Lord every day and ask him to refill us, to keep us full so that we're topped up, so that our lamps our light doesn't get dim, if you like. It doesn't flicker. It's strong and sure. It's giving out a good light. There's no hesitancy in the film, the light it's giving out. we must, like these servants, be prepared to serve our master in whatever way he required. I said that the word sort of changes in the passage to slave, depending. Most of the people, I mean, their service would be, if you had a good master, it could be quite pleasant. If you had a bad master, life would be unbearable. But whichever master you had, his word was law. You could not refuse. If you were a serving slave, you could not refuse, whatever they asked. We should have the same attitude, shouldn't we? Not out of fear, but out of love. How can we refuse the man who bears the nail prints in his hands? How can we refuse him? I like coffee. I try to like tea, but I just don't really like tea. But I do like coffee. I'm quite fond of coffee, and I'm very fond of coffee shops. But not all coffee and not all coffee shops are equal in my experience, in my opinion. Mine of choice is Cafe Nero. I'm not paid to say this, so I'll just share it with you. I have an app on my phone so that it makes it easy to go into Cafe Nero. But the one I really like of all the coffee, all the Cafe Neros I've been, and I've tried quite a few throughout the country because we go down to London and we go to Birmingham and I go to Norwich and Cambridge, different places. The Bury one is best. And there's two in Bury, and the one in Abbeygate Street is the best of the two. And the reason for that is that their work ethic is exceptionally good. They've had a manager there who's been there, Carol's been there for I don't know how many years, it's a long while. And her work ethic is very good. They work hard, they're very conscientious, and they're polite and efficient. What more can you want? And the coffee is good. The coffee is good. I was in there, I tend to have meetings with people in Cafe Nero. And so I've seen them at busy times and at times when they're less busy, times when there's probably only been me and somebody else in there. And if there are not many customers, the staff don't stand, they do talk to each other, obviously it'd be unbearable if they didn't, but they don't stand around chatting to each other. If there are not many people in there, they clear up, they make sure the tables are cleared and wiped clean, especially in these days, they're very thorough. They dust, they go around the stock and they readjust, they put the stock, limited stock that they have, they take it out and they dust it and they clean it. They're checking the tables to make sure the tables are okay, that the chairs are placed, and they're meticulous. And the thing is that they do that even when the manager isn't there. It's not something they just do because the manager's watching. They do it because they know that that's the right way to do things. And I think that if the Lord had been around, if Cafe Nero had been around in first century Palestine, I think Jesus might have used them as an example of good servants. Not just working when the master was watching, but even when he wasn't. Paul picks up this in Ephesians. He talks about, as slaves, you've got to work hard, not just when the manager's working. But in this household that we're talking about, in this parable, we have conscientious servants patiently waiting for the return of the master so they can serve him. They have got their loins girded, they've got their clothes all tucked up ready, they are ready for action, and the lamps are burning and they are keeping them bright. And they say the master's coming back from a wedding feast. He's not said that he's the bridegroom, he's been to a wedding feast, he's a guest and he's coming back. And of course events like this in first century Palestine could go on for days. So they don't know when he's coming. He may be coming later today, he may not be coming until tomorrow, it may be late at night, it may be first thing in the morning, depends when it finishes. Kenneth Bailey offers a slightly different outlook on this, which I like. I think I agree with him, because he's looked at various forms of the scriptures, you know, the scriptures that Jesus spoke in Aramaic, and they would have been probably remembered in Aramaic. But then when they were first written down, the New Testament was written in Greek, except I think Matthew was probably written in Hebrew. But they were written in, the New Testament ended up in, the Gospels ended up in New Testament Greek, what we call New Testament Greek. And then they were translated back to different languages, and one of them was Syriac, which is very similar to Aramaic. So it goes from Aramaic to Greek back to Aramaic again, almost. And he says that the Syriac version talks about the master withdrawing from the wedding feast. Now, you may think I'm just being pedantic, but there is a difference. He's not saying that the wedding feast was over. The Greek word translated come home is used, or withdraw is used in another place, which is why we read Philippians. Paul says, I feel torn between the two because I have a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. Now, he's not talking about the end of his life. He's not saying that my life is finished. He just says, I want to go, and I want to go now. I want to go early. And this is what Kenneth Bailey suggests, that in this parable, Jesus is saying that the master, because of his love for his servants, leaves the wedding feast early, particularly to come back, not, as we will see, to be served, but to serve them. Paul is torn between living and serving here on earth or going to be with the Lord. He would prefer to be with the Lord, but he knows he may have more service to do yet. Maybe there's still stuff for him to do. But when he says depart, it's the same word that's used of the master leaving the wedding feast in the parable. He withdraws from this feast. Paul hadn't finished, and he was prepared to finish, but he would love to leave early. It adds a new dimension, doesn't it? But it's not just that the wedding feast is over, everybody's had their fill and more, they've had a rest, they've started eating again, they're drinking, they're laughing, maybe there was dancing, whatever went on at a wedding, or whatever goes on at a wedding. And he was leaving early. He said, right, that's it, I've had a good time here, I've had good fellowship with these wonderful people, but now I'm going to leave. The feast isn't over, but I'm going to go back home. And you have to understand, I said, this is the cultural thing that we would say if somebody, you know, if you go off to a wedding, you go and find the bride and the groom and the bride's father and mother or whatever, the various important people, you say, well, it's been lovely, but we're leaving now. My son got married last, when was it, July, August, I think. And they had the wedding, and then we had a lovely reception. And then you have the second bit, don't you, when the youngsters are there and the music gets louder. And we went and saw them and said, right, yeah, we're off, boy. You know, my ears and head won't take anything like this anymore. And we left early. We accept that, it's all part of it. But in Jesus' day, if he would said that the master left early and came back, and then instead of just sitting back and saying, right, I'm ready, take my clothes off, wash me all over, and bring me food and drink, they would have understood. But he doesn't. He goes home and he does what he says his servants are doing. He girded his loins, he tucked his robe up. He said to the servants, settle down, recline at the table. I'm going to serve you. And there would have been an absolute stunned silence from his listeners. No way. This can't happen. This doesn't happen. There's no master is going to serve his servants. It doesn't happen. It's unheard of. It was the same when Jesus told the parable of the prodigal son, or the prodigal sons, when he talked about the father running. No way. Men don't run. It doesn't happen. Jesus was shocking and shocking his hearers by telling something like this. Not going to happen. It's so extreme. We can pass it by. This parable is all about Jesus as returning, the master. It's all about the servants, us, being ready. It's what the church refers to as eschatology, the last days or the last things. We don't know when they're going to be. All we know is that Jesus has promised he's coming back one day, and he's telling us we need to be ready. The time when Jesus will return for his bride, the church, which are we. But at its heart, as with so many of the parables and what Jesus spoke, it is grace, God's richest grace, undeserved favor that he doesn't just sprinkle, he doesn't just scatter, he deluges us with it, doesn't he? All the time, every day. You look for it, you'll find it. Somebody says it's outrageous grace. And we find it hard to believe. But this is what the Lord is demonstrating, that the master came home and was prepared to serve. Mark 10 tells us that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. It's the reason I read Psalm 23, because in verse 5, it says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You prepare a table, and you are not just preparing the table, Master, but you're going to serve us from that table. Once the table's prepared, we will sit down there with you and you will serve us. Because this psalm is talking about the crucifixion. And the preparation that God had in mind involved an unimaginable cost beyond any comparison. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son so he should be crucified and die and then rise again. In Psalm 23, the table in the presence of enemies is a metaphor. The cross in the life of Jesus was no metaphor. It was harsh reality. The word picture that Jesus is painting here with his words is of a master returning home very late during the night, perhaps, probably the early hours of the morning. He finds his servants, or perhaps they may even be slaves. They may have no choice in the matter. But whatever, he finds them ready to serve him. They are waiting. They have done what is expected. They've got their robes all tucked up so they're not going to get in the way. There's no hurried rush to get everything ready, to put the apron on or to get everything. It's all ready. They're all prepared. They've been waiting for hours, perhaps, could have been days, but they're ready. The lights are bright. The moment there's a knock on the door, they open it and they are prepared to serve. And the master has a right to expect nothing less. That's the standard that he expects. But this is what is so amazing about our master. You remember in the upper room when the disciples gathered for that last Passover feast with the Lord? He said, I want to celebrate this with you. And the picture is of all the disciples, including Judas, trooping into that room, studiously ignoring the bowl, the jug of water, and the towel that's set there to wash their feet. It would have been polite for someone to have said, oh, I'll do that. But they wouldn't. They would not demean themselves, because washing somebody else's feet was the lowest form of service you could get. In fact, I think it's true that the Jews would not use a Jewish servant to do it. They would employ a Gentile servant to do it. It was that demeaning. And what was it Jesus did? He said he took off his outer robes. The commentators think that he just really stripped down to his loincloth so he would look like a slave. He wasn't naked, that would have been inappropriate, but close to it, he just wore his loincloth. He then knelt at their feet and he washed their feet, the lowest form of service imaginable. and he would have girded himself, ready for action. I know it's a Christmas carol, but the lines, "Thou didst leave thy throne and thy kingly crown when thou camest to earth for me," seems appropriate, doesn't it? Seems to sum up this parable. When you consider everything the Lord left behind, when you consider the glory of heaven, when you consider the glory he had with the Father, and he was prepared to leave all that and come down here. And if he'd come into 21st century Colchester or Suffolk or Essex or wherever, that would have been enough. But to go into first century Palestine, where things, to say the least, were very primitive, it wouldn't have been a comfortable place. You could have probably been okay, but you didn't have nice interior sprung mattresses. Maybe you had a straw palliasse or something to sleep on. It wasn't comfortable. It was harsh. It was brutal. But he left it all for us. And when he comes again, Jesus will come to invite us to the greatest feast of all time. We find that in Revelation chapter 19. In verse 6, "Then I heard what seemed to be the voice of a great multitude, like the roar of many waters, and the sound of mighty peals of thunder, crying out, Hallelujah! For the Lord our God, the Almighty, reigns. Let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory. For the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. It was granted to her to clothe herself with fine linen, bright and pure. For the fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints. And the angel said to me, Write this, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, These are the true words of God. Then I fell down at his feet to worship him. But he said to me, You must not do that. I am a fellow servant with you and your brothers who hold to the testimony of Jesus. Worship God, for the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. One day, the Master is coming. We don't know when it will be. Are you prepared? Are you ready? We trust we are.